There is a moment when you understand that your life could fall apart right now. Not tomorrow, not next week, right now. While you're standing there with a drink in your hand, while the people you love are laughing around you, while music plays and candles flicker on the tables, and everything looks exactly the way a happy evening is supposed to look. I was 34 years old. Daniel and I were celebrating our 5th wedding anniversary. A restaurant we had spent 3 weeks choosing. Small, warm, unpretentious in the way that good places sometimes manage to be. 22 people, the inner circle, the ones who had actually been present in our lives. I was wearing a dress I had bought specifically for that night. Dark navy, simple. The kind of thing that makes you feel like yourself, rather than like a version of yourself assembled for an occasion. Daniel was looking at me across the table with that specific expression. The one he used to wear in the very beginning, before everything between us became familiar. Everything was right. The food, the light, the people, the man across from me. Everything was exactly right. And then the door opened. I saw him before he saw me. A fraction of a second, and I recognized him immediately, even though 5 years had passed. Alexei. Him. The one person in the world I was never supposed to see again. Never anywhere, under any circumstances, and especially not here, at our anniversary dinner, with Daniel sitting 3 feet away from me. Daniel pushed back his chair and walked toward him with a smile. A wide, genuine, completely unguarded smile. The smile of a man happy to see a colleague he likes. They shook hands. Daniel turned toward me. "Come meet my wife." Alexei walked with him. He looked at me as they approached. I don't know how long that moment lasted. Inside me, it was endless. From the outside, it was probably 1 second, maybe less. Long enough for his eyes to find mine, and for something to pass between us that had no business existing in this room. I smiled. I don't know where that smile came from. It appeared before I made any decision to produce it, like a reflex, the body understanding the stakes before the mind catches up. Smile. Whatever you do, look normal. Because if you stop looking normal right now, everything falls apart. He said, "Nice to meet you." His voice was perfectly steady. I said, "You too." My voice was perfectly steady. The glass in my hand suddenly weighed 1,000 pounds. "My name is Nicole. I'm 34 years old. And I want to tell you a story about how one night from 5 years ago walked back into my life through the front door on the exact evening I was most certain it was behind me forever. About what it means to carry a secret you cannot share with anyone. And about 30 seconds in a hallway at the end of that evening that either changed everything or changed nothing at all. I am still not entirely sure which. If stories about real people with real mistakes and real consequences mean something to you, hit like and subscribe. And drop a comment telling me where you're watching from right now. I read every single one. Now let's go back. 5 years back. An April work trip. A conference in another city. And an evening that was never supposed to become anything more than a conversation. I want you to understand one thing before I tell you the rest. Not to excuse what I did. I'm not looking for an excuse, and I'm not going to offer one. But because without this, the rest makes no sense, and I'd rather tell it true than tell it in a way that protects me. I loved my husband. I love him. Present tense, no qualification. That is the complicated heart of all of this. Not the simple version where the marriage was broken and someone filled the gap, but the harder version where the marriage was real and the person in it was real, and something happened anyway. We met by accident. A coffee shop line on a Tuesday morning, him standing in front of me, both of us ordering exactly the same thing at exactly the same moment. I laughed. He turned around. We ended up at the same table and talked for 2 hours, even though both of us had places to be. We met again the next day, not by accident. Within a year, we were sharing a lease. Within 2, we were getting married. 27 people, a cake that listed slightly to one side, me standing across from him thinking, this is the right thing. This is exactly right. Daniel isn't the kind of man people describe as exciting or magnetic. He's the kind they describe as dependable. And that is not a default compliment. It is a rare quality you only fully appreciate once you've lived alongside people who weren't. He did what he said he'd do. He remembered what mattered. He could admit when he was wrong, which is rarer than it should be. The first 2 years of marriage were the good kind of hard. We were figuring each other out at close range, with all the friction and warmth that involves. By year 4, something had quietly shifted. Not a crisis. I want to be clear about that. No specific fight, no particular failing. Just a gradual settling into parallel existence. His laptop on one end of the couch, my book on the other. The television running in the background that neither of us was fully watching. I loved him, but I had lost the feeling of being seen. Of someone talking to you like your words are interesting. Of existing in someone else's perception as something still being discovered, rather than something already completely known. That is not a justification. I am saying it deliberately. It is not a justification. It's simply part of the honest account of how a bad choice gets made. The work trip was in April. A 3-day marketing conference in another city. The kind I attended 2 or 3 times a year. Part of the job, nothing unusual. A hotel, a packed schedule, colleagues from other companies, lunches at round tables with people you see once a year and only recognize by their badge. The seating at the first evening's dinner was assigned. I found my name card, sat down, introduced myself to the people around me. The man on my right was Alexei. He introduced himself the way people do at these things. Name, company, what he worked on, and then did something most people at conference dinners don't do, which was stop talking about himself almost immediately and ask me something real. Not a networking question. He asked what I was actually hoping to take away from this conference. It was such a simple thing. But simple things land differently depending on who's asking and how carefully they're listening. We talked through dinner. He was smart. Not performing intelligence, actually using it. Asking questions that showed he had tracked the conversation rather than waited for his turn. Funny, in a quiet way, the kind that comes from noticing things rather than rehearsing material. The dinner ended. I was intending to go back to my room. Somehow, I ended up at the bar instead, and somehow Alexei was there, and somehow we kept talking for another hour. Nothing during that first evening felt like anything other than a good conversation. I went back to my room at midnight thinking, that was good. I hadn't had a conversation like that in a while. The second day, we ended up near each other again. Not by accident, and we both knew it. The conversation continued, about work, and then past work, into the things people actually care about. The kind of conversation that requires a certain amount of trust to have and creates more trust in the having. By the second evening, I was aware of what was happening. I want to be clear about that. I wasn't surprised or swept away or unaware. I knew. I made a choice. It was a conscious, bad choice, and those two things are both true, and neither cancels the other. I won't describe the details, not because I can't face them, but because they're not the part that matters. What matters is that it was once, one evening. I woke up at 5 in the morning, got dressed quietly, left, walked back down the hall to my own room, and lay on top of the covers staring at the ceiling until the light changed. He sent a message in the morning. I replied once and then didn't respond again. The third day of the conference, we moved around each other at a polite distance that had formed between us without being discussed. It was finished. I flew home on Friday. On the plane, I thought about Daniel, specifically about how he would be at the airport because he always was. He'd have the dog with him, he'd carry my bag, he'd ask how it went. He was exactly there. He hugged me and said, "Missed you." I pressed my face into his shoulder and said, "Me too." And I meant it completely. That was the hardest part. I meant it completely. He had bought flowers, yellow tulips, my favorite, which he remembered from something I'd mentioned once, early in our relationship. The way you mention small preferences to someone you're getting to know without expecting them to stick. He remembered. He put them in the vase on the kitchen table. They were there all weekend. I couldn't look at them directly. That was the first sign that something had changed in the internal architecture of my days. Ordinary things had become weighted. The flowers. His habit of resting his hand on my shoulder as he passed. The way he laughed at something on Sunday afternoon, openly, easily, with no awareness that there was anything to be guarded about. All of it pressed down on me. Not because it was unbearable, but because it was normal. Because he didn't know anything, and his not knowing was the most painful part. I didn't tell anyone. Not my closest friend, who would have listened without judgment. Not a therapist. I didn't have one at the time, and starting to see one right now felt too pointed, too much like a confession. I carried it entirely alone. Guilt works quietly. That's something you don't know until you're inside it. You expect it to be loud, to announce itself constantly and make normal life impossible. In the beginning, it was louder, but then it became embedded. A low-frequency hum running underneath everything, present the moment the room got quiet enough. Not always at the front of my awareness, just always there. I became more attentive to Daniel, and this is the bitter irony I've never fully made peace with. The guilt made me a better wife, in every observable day-to-day sense. I cooked dinners I would previously have suggested ordering in. I asked about his work and listened to the actual answer. I noticed when he was tired and responded to it instead of retreating into my own world. He noticed. He said a few times, "You seem really present lately." I said, "I've just been thinking about us." He smiled. I smiled back. Months passed, then a year. The secret didn't get lighter. It got more familiar. Like something you've been carrying long enough that your muscles have adjusted, so you don't feel the weight the same way anymore. It's just part of what carrying yourself feels like. The open wound became a scar. Scars are permanent, but they don't bleed every day. 5 years is long enough to live through several versions of a marriage, and several versions of yourself inside it. In those 5 years, we went through Daniel's father's illness, which was serious and prolonged, and ended the way those things end. We moved apartments, 2 months of boxes, eating on the windowsill because the table was still in storage. We went through his professional crisis, a year when a project he'd poured 3 years into was shut down without warning, and he went quiet and flat, in the way people do when something they believed in is taken away. I learned during that year how to be alongside grief without pressing into it, how to be in the room with someone who is struggling and let that be enough. All of it brought us closer in the specific, unromantic way that shared hardship does. Not the closeness of easy happiness, but the closeness of having been through the weight of things together, and both still being there. The memory of that April in year 4 had moved very far back on the shelf. I want to be precise. It hadn't disappeared, and I wasn't pretending it had. I had done enough honest internal work to stop needing to pretend. But it was managed, integrated. Not an open wound, a scar. Present, but not bleeding. In January, Daniel started a new job. A consulting firm, the right kind of role, exactly the direction he'd been wanting to go. The energy he brought home in the first weeks was different from the muted energy of the previous year. He was engaged, interested, talking about the work at dinner with real enthusiasm. He mentioned colleagues. One name came up more than the others. Smart, Daniel said. Easy to work with. Actually listens. The name was Alexei. The first time I heard it, something very small moved inside me. A flicker, barely there. I told myself, that name belongs to a lot of people. Coincidence. I gave it 30 seconds of attention and put it down. I did this several times over the following months, each time more easily than the last. In March, we started planning the anniversary. Daniel said, I want to invite a few people from the new job, the ones I've actually connected with. I said, invite whoever you want. 3 days before the party, over dinner on a Wednesday, he mentioned it between passing the salt and talking about whether we needed to confirm the head count. He said, Alexei's coming, by the way. He was happy to be included. I heard it. I set my fork down and picked it up again and said, Great. Completely even. I spent the next 3 days doing what I had been doing for 5 years, managing something internally while appearing completely normal on the surface. It was probably a different person. The name was not uncommon. 5 years had passed. The world was large. The night of the anniversary, I put on the dark navy dress. I looked in the mirror. I looked like someone going to a happy celebration of 5 years of a good marriage. I told myself, you are fine. What happened is behind you. You built something real. I walked into the restaurant, found our table. Daniel was already there, laughing with someone. Candles, flowers, the low, warm hum of people who are glad to be together. The door opened, and everything I had spent 5 years putting behind me walked through it. Chapter 6. The Evening with a False Bottom. Alexei was perfectly behaved. That was the first thing I registered after the initial 30 seconds of survival mode. That he was going to be exactly what the situation required him to be, which was a pleasant new colleague of Daniel's, attending an anniversary party, and nothing else. No meaningful glances, no coded language, no hesitation in the handshake, no micro-expression that someone paying close enough attention might catch. He was completely, fluently normal, which should have been a relief. It was, in the functional sense. It meant the evening was survivable. But it also produced something strange and disorienting, because there is a particular quality to being in a room with someone who is acting as though they don't know you when they do. A flatness at the center of things. A gap between what is visible and what is real that only you can see. I watched him the way you watch something you cannot afford to look at too directly. Peripheral, careful. He moved through the room easily, shook hands, laughed at the right moments, asked people questions about themselves in the way of someone socially comfortable and genuinely interested. Daniel was clearly pleased to have him there. I watched them together, my husband and this man, talking with the easy warmth of colleagues who have found each other good company, and I had the specific, vertiginous experience of understanding that two people you know can exist in completely separate contexts, and that the overlap, when it happens, belongs only to you. Daniel brought him over to introduce him to various people throughout the evening. Each time, I was at the right conversational distance, close enough to be present, not so close that I had to maintain direct interaction for more than a few sentences. I answered when I was spoken to. I asked a question or two. I kept my wine glass full enough that I had something to do with my hands. Inwardly, I was somewhere else entirely. Not panicking. I want to be clear about that because panic implies a loss of control, and I didn't lose control. What I was doing was something more exhausting than panic, which was the sustained effort of appearing completely fine while every sensory input in the room was filtered through the knowledge of what I was managing. The candlelight that had seemed warm and beautiful an hour ago now felt too close. The laughter of the people I loved most, friends I'd had for a decade, family members I saw every holiday, felt like it was happening in a slightly different version of the room than the one I was occupying. My best friend Claire sat next to me for a stretch of the evening and talked about something, her new apartment, I think, or possibly her job, or both. I tracked the conversation well enough to respond at the right moments. Later, I couldn't have told you what we discussed. At some point during the main course, I went to the restroom and stood at the sink and ran cold water over my wrists for about 45 seconds and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked fine. I looked like someone at a nice dinner who had stepped away for a moment. Nothing on my face that wasn't supposed to be there. I went back to the table. I smiled at my husband. He smiled back. The evening was ending. Dessert, coffee, the gradual dispersal of people gathering coats and saying their goodbyes. Alexei was one of the last to leave. He'd been pulled into a longer conversation with two of Daniel's other colleagues near the end, and by the time that wound down, most of the other guests had already gone. He said his goodbyes at the table, shook Daniel's hand again, thanked us both for including him, said something warm and general about the evening. I stood up and we exchanged the standard social farewell. Brief, appropriate, the kind of thing that gives nothing away because it is designed to give nothing away. And then somehow, in the specific geography of people moving toward the exit at the same time, coats being retrieved, Daniel pausing to settle the bill, Alexei and I were alone in the hallway for approximately 30 seconds. 30 seconds. He looked at me. Not with anything I could name clearly. Not accusation, not warmth exactly, not guilt. Something more neutral than any of those things. The look of someone acknowledging a shared fact. He said, quietly, "You haven't changed." I didn't say anything. I wasn't sure what category of response was available to me. He said, "I remember everything." I'm not going to say anything. That's not my story to tell. But I want you to know that I'm not carrying this as a weapon. I have a wife. I understand what this is. I understand what we both chose and what we both have to live with. I looked at him. He said, "I thought you should know that." I heard Daniel's voice from the other room, a laugh, the sound of a conversation wrapping up. Alexei glanced toward the sound and then back at me. He said, "Good night, Nicole." It was a nice evening. And then Daniel appeared in the hallway doorway, putting on his coat, and we all three exchanged the final goodnight of the evening, and Alexei walked out the front door of the restaurant, and that was it. He was gone. The door closed behind him. Daniel put his arm around my shoulders and said, "Good night, huh? Everyone seemed to have a good time." He seemed genuinely happy, the contented tiredness of someone whose evening had gone the way he hoped. I leaned into him slightly. I said, "It was a really good night." He kissed the top of my head. We took a cab home. Daniel talked about the evening, things people had said, a funny moment I'd completely missed because I had been somewhere else. I listened. I answered. I was present in every external way. Inside, I was very still. Not numb, that's not the right word. More like the particular stillness that follows something significant. When the ground has shifted and you're standing on it, waiting to understand what has actually changed. What Alexei had said was not a threat. I had registered that immediately, in the way you register the absence of something you were braced for. He hadn't threatened me. He hadn't implied leverage. He had simply acknowledged the thing that existed between us and then released it, handed me back the full weight of it without trying to use it for anything. I'm not carrying this as a weapon. I thought I should know that. I didn't know, lying in the dark next to Daniel that night, whether this made things better or worse. Both, probably. Neither, maybe. The thing existed. It had always existed. Knowing that he remembered it too, that it was not only mine, changed the shape of it without changing what it was. Daniel fell asleep quickly, the way he always did after a social evening. He was good at releasing the day. I lay beside him and looked at the ceiling and thought about 30 seconds in a hallway, and about all the years on either side of them, and about the fact that a life is made up of all of these things simultaneously. The good and the bad, and the secret and the ordinary, and that somehow you are all of them at once, all the time, and you carry all of it forward. I didn't sleep for a long time. Daniel was asleep by 11:30. I was awake until almost 3. Not crying, not spiraling. I want to describe this accurately because the version where I lay awake in dramatic anguish would be simpler and would not be quite true. What I was doing was thinking. Slowly, deliberately, without rushing toward any conclusion. Turning the evening over in my mind, like something I was examining from different angles to understand what it actually was. The question that kept returning was the same one I had been avoiding for 5 years, the one that gets easier to sidestep when time passes and the urgency fades. What do I do with this? Not in the practical sense. I understood the practical situation. Alexei wasn't going to say anything. He had told me as much, and more importantly, I believed him. Not because I trusted him entirely on the basis of a 5-year-old single encounter and 30 seconds in a hallway, but because what he had said had the ring of something true. He had a wife. He understood what was at stake. He had nothing to gain from disruption. So the practical question was settled. The other question, the one that had no practical component, the one that was purely internal, was still there. The same question it had always been. Not whether to tell Daniel. Whether to keep living with not telling him. Whether that was a livable thing. Whether I had already decided, by 5 years of not deciding, that it was. I thought about Daniel asleep beside me, about the specific quality of sleeping next to someone you love, the sound of their breathing, the warmth of them, the particular safety of their presence in the dark. About the evening we had just had, the 22 people, the restaurant we had chosen together, the way he had looked at me across the table with that expression from the beginning. About what we had built in 5 years that was real and durable and worth protecting. I thought about what telling him would do to those things. Not to me, to him. To the specific person sleeping beside me who had bought yellow tulips and met me at airports and sat in hospital parking lots and carried boxes up flights of stairs and fallen asleep next to me every night for 5 years. What it would mean for him to know. What it would take from him that he currently had. The version of his marriage that existed in his understanding, which was whole and honest and real in the way he understood it. I had asked myself this question before, many times in the first year. The answer had always pointed in the same direction, and I had always been slightly uncomfortable with the direction it pointed, because it felt self-serving. It is easier to stay silent when silence also protects you. The question is whether the protection it offers the other person is real, or whether it is the story you tell yourself to justify the protection it offers you. I didn't resolve this that night. I have not resolved it cleanly in the time since. What I arrived at, eventually, in the small hours of that morning, was something more like an honest acknowledgement than a resolution. I had made a choice 5 years ago that I could not unmake. I had made a second choice, every day since, to carry it rather than share it. Those choices had consequences that belonged to me. The question of whether they were the right choices was one I would probably be sitting with for the rest of my life. At some point after 2 in the morning, I turned onto my side, facing Daniel. He was deeply asleep, breathing slowly, completely unaware. I looked at him for a moment in the dark. Then I closed my eyes. The weeks that followed were quieter than I expected. Alexei remained Daniel's colleague. They worked together on a project in the fall. I knew this because Daniel mentioned it at dinner, the way he mentioned anything from work, without particular emphasis. I listened to those mentions with the specific attention of someone managing information, and said the appropriate things and moved on. It became a practiced thing, like most repeated efforts become practiced things. Not easy, exactly, but manageable. The thing Alexei had said in the hallway stayed with me in a specific way. Not as a threat or a complication, as he had promised it wouldn't be, but as a kind of mirror. He had looked at me and said, "I understand what we both chose and what we both have to live with." And what struck me, kept striking me over the weeks and months afterward, was the word both. Both chose. Both have to live with. I had spent 5 years thinking about this as my burden, my secret, my choice, my thing to manage. And of course it was. I'm not diminishing that. I'm not distributing the responsibility somewhere it doesn't belong. But there was something clarifying about being reminded, in those 30 seconds, that I was not the only person in the world who had done something they had to live with afterward. That the moral complexity of this was not uniquely mine. That the human condition of having made a mistake and having to integrate it into a life is, in fact, extremely common. Not comforting, exactly, but accurate. In October, I called a therapist. Not because the Alexei situation had created a new crisis. It hadn't, or not in the way you might expect. But because I had been carrying something alone for 5 years, and I was tired of carrying it alone. And going to a therapist was the one available option for not carrying it alone that didn't require me to transfer the weight to someone it would hurt. The first appointment was hard. The second was harder. By the third, I had said out loud to another human being the thing I had not said out loud for 5 years. It didn't fix anything. I hadn't expected it to fix anything. But it changed the specific quality of what I was carrying. The difference between a weight you hold alone and a weight that someone else knows about and has agreed to sit with you while you hold it. Daniel and Alexei's project ended in November. After that, their professional paths crossed less directly. Different teams, different clients. The name came up in conversation less often. The particular vigilance I had maintained for months gradually, incrementally relaxed. Not gone. I don't think this kind of vigilance ever goes completely, but less acute, less daily. Daniel and I had a good winter. A quiet one. More evenings at home than out. The kind of domestic rhythm that I used to think was the beginning of the drift, but had come to understand differently. There is a version of quiet that is distance, and there is a version that is comfort. I had learned, over 5 years, to tell them apart. What we had that winter was the second kind. He said to me one evening in December, we were cooking dinner together, the specific, ordinary intimacy of two people in a kitchen moving around each other. He said, "I feel like we're in a good place." I looked at him. I said, "I think we are." He said, "I'm glad," and went back to what he was doing. I stood there for a moment with a wooden spoon in my hand and thought about everything that sentence contained, and everything it didn't contain, and the relationship between those two things. Then I went back to what I was doing, too. I've been sitting with this story for a long time, trying to figure out what it's actually about. It's tempting to make it about the narrow thing, the one night, the 5 years of silence, the 30 seconds in a hallway. Those things are real, and they matter, and I'm not minimizing them. But I think the story is actually about something larger, which is the question of how you live with yourself after you've done something that cannot be undone. Not in the dramatic sense, in the ordinary, daily sense. How you get up in the morning and make coffee and ask how someone's day was and go to sleep and wake up again. How you do the continuous, unremarkable work of being a person who is trying to be good, knowing that you have also been, at a specific moment, not good. How you hold those two things at once without letting either of them erase the other. I am not a good person who made one bad choice. I am not a bad person who occasionally does good things. I am a person, specific, complicated, full of contradictions that don't resolve cleanly, who made a choice I'm not proud of and has been living with it ever since, and trying to live well in spite of it. That is not a redemption arc. It is just what being a person looks like when you're honest about it. There is a version of this story where I tell Daniel, where I sit down one evening and say, "I need to tell you something, and it happened a long time ago, and I'm telling you because I believe you deserve the truth." I have imagined this conversation many times. I know what it would cost him, specifically and in detail, because I know him well enough to understand what the knowledge would do to the specific person he is. And I know that my reason for not having that conversation is not entirely about protecting him. Some of it is about protecting myself and the life we have built together. I know that. I have never been able to not know that. What I have decided, and I say decided knowing it is the kind of decision that gets made again every day, is that I will live as honestly as I can with what I carry. That means the therapist, who I still see. That means not flinching from the harder versions of the questions when they come up. That means being present in my marriage in the specific, attentive way of someone who understands what it means to put it at risk and has decided, deliberately, not to take that risk again. Is that enough? I genuinely don't know. There are frameworks in which it isn't, in which full honesty is the only acceptable form of repair, and anything short of it is a continued lie. I don't dismiss those frameworks. I think about them. They make me uncomfortable in the way that true things sometimes do. What I know is this. I love the man sleeping in the next room. I know him better than anyone in the world knows him, and he knows me better than anyone knows me. Except for the one thing. I have been faithful to him for 5 years since the one time I wasn't. I have been more present, more attentive, more genuinely grateful for what we have than I might have been if that April had never happened. And I am uncomfortable with that too. With the idea that a failure might have contributed to something good. Because it seems like the wrong kind of story. But lives don't always tell the stories we would choose for them. Alexei eventually moved to a different firm. I heard this from Daniel, who mentioned it without particular emphasis on a Tuesday in the spring, the way you mention any minor workplace change. I said, "Oh," and then the conversation moved on. I thought about it for a day or two, and then I put it down, the way I had been putting things down for 6 years by then. I was getting better at it. I want to say one thing directly to whoever is listening right now. Because I think there are people in this audience who are carrying something. Maybe not this exact thing, but something. Something they made a choice about that they can't unmake. Something they live with every day in the space between who they are and who they wish they had been. I want to say, the carrying is real. The weight of it is real. And the fact that you are still here, still trying, still showing up for your life and the people in it, that is also real. It doesn't cancel anything out, but it is also something. It counts. You are not only what you did at your worst moment. You are also everything you have done since. If this story reached something in you, if you're carrying something you don't know what to do with, or if you've been there and found your way through, tell me in the comments. I read every single one. Thank you for listening. Take care of yourselves.